Hello, and welcome to the Module 3 presentation. This is about engaging learners in HyFlex courses. And so we are going to be talking about different ways that we can engage learners in the classroom, online in the synchronous mode, online in the asynchronous mode, and of course, all learners in all modes at the same time, perhaps with similar activities or the same activities. Engagement is one of the most critical aspects of HyFlex course design. If we don't have good engagement in various modes, we are not going to get a lot of great student learning, probably. There's often these things go together. And it's also important as designers and as faculty members and teachers to appreciate the importance of engagement because you have to be engaged too. The facilitation of learning is critical and requires the engagement of the facilitator, whoever that might be. Without an engaged facilitator, an engaged faculty member, engaged teacher, you're probably not going to have very engaged students, right? And engaged students are going to create the opportunity for engaged learning. And of course, we think that will be deeper learning. So what I'm going to do is share the presentation that's provided in Module 3 of the workshop. And I'm going to go through this once again relatively quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on some of the slides. Some of them have links into other places, and you can certainly look at those on your own time as you have interest and you have the ability to do so. So we're talking about engaging learners in each mode and across each mode. There's a couple of principles I want to discuss at the beginning of this before we start talking about specific engagement practices. And essentially, there are three of them. The first one is about what we call a community of inquiry. How do we build a community of learners who are together pursuing knowledge in a particular area, even though they may be doing this in different modes? We're going to talk about cognitive presence, social presence, teaching presence. We'll also talk about levels of interaction in there as well, which is a concept you may be familiar with. And we're also going to spend a little time talking about transactional distance and learner autonomy and why the various modes that we offer in HyFlex might be a really good fit for students who have various levels of learner autonomy, their ability to learn independently on their own, managing their own learning, or their ability to learn with others around them where they're being guided more. All right. And then finally, we'll talk about engaging learners in each of the modes and then, of course, all together. So that's essentially what I'm going to talk through right now. And you'll find these slides to be covering those areas. When we look at HyFlex, once again, we're looking at a single learning community that is served and serving students through different modes, a face-to-face mode and at least one online mode. That's what HyFlex is. So let's keep that clear. And the engagement component, I think, is one of the most important parts that bring us together into a single learning community, even if it's a very light community, like little C community, not a lot of community, but some community. We want to make sure that students who are learning online know that there are students learning in other modes and they're able to interact with them in some meaningful way. And it doesn't really matter which direction it is, but we want to make sure that if there's 20 people or 50 people in a class, they know that they're learning in a class of 20 people or 50 people, not the 4 people they find in the classroom or the 4 people they find online asynchronously that particular week. When we talk about the HyFlex principles again, just as a reminder, where are these principles implemented in engaging learners? Are there alternative paths and are they equally or equivalently engaging, should I say? So alternatives, learner choice, equivalence, reuse. Can I create engagement approaches that work in all modes for all learners? Maybe at the same time, that would be a good opportunity for reuse. Does the engagement we do in the classroom contribute to the learning of the online students? Does the engagement we do in the online paths of the course contribute to the face-to-face learners, participatory learning? And is it engaging and accessible? Oftentimes we use technologies for engagement. Those technologies have to be accessible for all of our learners. And if we can have them accessible by design, perfect. If not, we have to have good, reasonable, and equivalent workarounds if for some reason we're using a technology that isn't accessible for some reason. A lot of our engagement technology relies on aspects of being able to engage, like visually, that perhaps not all of our students can do. So when a student comes to us like that, what do we do to make sure that they're getting an equivalent learning experience? Not the same one, not equal, but certainly equivalent. And remember, the engagement is one of the important legs of our stool that holds up our student learning outcomes. The goal is to achieve the learning outcomes. We talked about content and assessment in the Module 2 presentation. Now we're going to focus on the third leg of the stool, engagement. And from a perspective of a designer, you are designing for the facilitation of learning. from a teacher perspective and a professor perspective, a faculty perspective, your job is to facilitate learning, not just to provide content, not just to assess learning, but also to facilitate the learning. It's one of the main reasons that we have real people facilitating our courses, even when they're fully online asynchronously. A course, an asynchronous course that runs by itself without facilitation is not really what we want to provide in higher education or K-12 education, really any level of education. However, there may be a role for that. We call that e-learning. We call that, oftentimes there are MOOCs that are like this, but that's a different kind of learning environment, much more of a skills-focused training rather than an engaged understanding and interactive, active learning engagement like we try to do in most of our educational contexts. So before we jump into community of inquiry, there's a concept that was started to be written about maybe in the 1980s, a long time ago, when online learning started to become more popular. This idea of interaction between various members or components of the learning environment, really members, the people involved, the students, the instructor, and then the content, which has another important role. Interaction among all of these three major points of this triangle, create a learning environment. So we want students to be able to interact with the content. We talked about content again in module 2. Is that content engaging for them? Can they interact with it? Can they influence it? Can they produce it? All of those are forms of interaction with content. How do students interact with each other? So peer engagement. Are they providing each other peer feedback? Are they providing each other discussion points in person, online, or in an asynchronous online discussion perhaps? Is it an engaging process for them? Or are they interacting with each other? As they interact, they share understanding. As they share understanding, they change their own understanding, and hopefully they're increasing their understanding, of course, towards the achievement of the outcome. How do students interact with the instructor? Yes, the instructor. Even in the asynchronous path of your course, you're expected to be there. You have to be there. Not all the time, not 24/7, but on a regular basis, students should know that you're there, you're interacting with them, and you're helping mentor and facilitate their learning, just like you would as if you were in the classroom with them or maybe in the Zoom room with them. All right, so we have different levels of interaction, and each one of these are going to be important as you design your engagement strategies for your HyFlex course. So when we talk about the community of inquiry idea, we're really talking about presence. And these are concepts, again, that were developed in the 1980s and 90s, really, as the beginning of online learning. Text-based online asynchronous learning became a lot more popular. So right around the year 2000 or so, we started using the language around community of inquiry, which is essentially designed to build a solid foundation, right, of social presence and teaching presence to stimulate cognitive presence, thinking towards an outcome in a course, right? So if we were trying to do this only with text, maybe pictures and text, how hard is that? Well, we have to use our language skills to do that. We have to use our words to do that. And so the writing that started around this was really talking about that kind of environment. How do we support the fact that people have to know that other people are learning with them, even though they'll never see them in person? Remember, asynchronous only online course. This is what it was designed for. That there's a teacher there, even though you may never see that person. You may never talk to them in person, but there should be their influence there. You should see that there's evidence of a teacher and the action of a teacher is there. Cognitive presence, is everything that I'm asked to do in this asynchronous online course contributing to my learning? Okay, so those are really the three different areas. All of them work together to create the effective learning experience and, in general, shaping a community of learners who are working together. So let's talk about each of these presences a little bit more. Cognitive presence is essentially the extent to which the participants in any particular configuration of community of inquiry, like our classes, are able to construct meaning through sustained communication. So we are communicating in a way that helps us learn. We're sharing ideas. We're testing out ideas. We're getting feedback on our ideas and giving feedback on other ideas. So this is really important. Everything we do in our courses should be connected to cognitive presence, either directly, like content, assessment, engagement with content as the focus, or indirectly. Sometimes we do engagement activities that are designed to help people learn who the other people are in the course, like icebreaker activities. Do they contribute to cognitive presence? Possibly, but they also, maybe they're important roles. They enable the future interactions and the understandings that are being shared because people now know the other people. So it's an enabling activity perhaps that contributes to cognitive presence. I'm not going to read through all of these. You can certainly read these on your own. So some of the things that support cognitive presence, this is an important aspect for our design. What do we have that gets in the way of this? If there's too much information to access, it's not well organized. The information architecture is poor. That can prevent students from accessing the things they need when they need them. Sometimes it's not interactive at all. Oh, I've got to read another 40 pages, out of this textbook, online articles, etc. But is there a more interesting way to get this? Maybe there's another way to provide this. Maybe there's an explanation video that could summarize it and point them into the more important parts of whatever it is they're being asked to read. So you can make the content perhaps more engaging. What makes it easier to get cognitive presence? Information, easy to find, easy to access, easy to use. It's the right amount. It's at the right time. It's interactive. Perhaps you're using rich media. So all of those things support this idea of cognitive presence. We talk about social presence. This is the ability of everybody in the learning community, essentially the students in the classes or the people in your workshops, to project their personal characteristics into the community, representing themselves as real people. And so think about this as a text-based exchange. The use of words to present myself as a real person, can look like certain things. Social presence is, of course, it's a direct contributor to the success of education. It gives people kind of the freedom, maybe the motivation, and perhaps the confidence to share their ideas. And it's through the sharing of ideas that help shape the development of ideas, which is essentially what creates the learning outcomes that we're looking for. Okay, so this is an important part. And as a faculty member, you have a leadership role in this. You also have a participation role in this. Your students primarily are participants in this, but sometimes they take on leadership roles as well. So some of the things that can help with social presence. One, expressing emotions in your communications. Sometimes this looks like humor or self-disclosure, always obviously appropriate levels, but we're sharing our attitudes, our experiences. As we share our experiences, people get to know who you are a little bit more, and you get to know who they are a little bit more. Just typically, if you share your experiences, it's more likely that the other students or the other participants in the discussion or the interaction, whatever it might be, are more likely to share their own experiences. So sometimes we're using emoticons or other kinds of little graphical pieces, little images here and there to help us with this. So that can help, especially when it's mostly text-based discourse. Another thing to think about is this idea of open communication, that's respectful. It values the opinions of others. It reciprocates when someone puts out an interesting idea and we give our feedback. We give our feedback more than just, hey, that's a great idea. I love it. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Or I just don't agree. Moving on. All right. So this idea of mutual awareness and recognition of others' contribution, these can go a long way. And you can do this with words. And as a faculty member, as a designer, you can sprinkle this in and maybe add some example posts or model it when you actually are doing your own posts. Another element of social presence could be called group cohesion. So if you have activities built into the course that create a sense of group commitment, these could be smaller groups, it could be a larger group, right? So students are part of a learning process. Sometimes a class could create a set of resources that they're exploring together or that they discover while they're going through the instructional program that you have set up for them. So they're creating a shared resource for them to share with each other. Maybe it's a takeaway. In my courses, I often use like a shared Google Doc, something that we do in class or in our live breakouts in synchronous, or the asynchronous students participate also, but we're creating a shared notes document in a class of 15 weeks. With 20 or 25 students, I might end with 50 pages of notes from our discussions or the contributions to cognitive contributions or idea contributions, concepts that they're learning in class that they're just putting their own expression of those. Two or three sentences, a week from everybody might be enough for something like that. But they're doing this as a group, and they're creating something that's useful to them as a group. And smaller groups, of course, have their own thing. So if you do group projects, that also creates a sense of the group cohesion. I find ways to do group projects that don't rely on people always in the same modes. So A lot of the work is done asynchronously or at least coordinated out of the regular class time. So asynchronous learners in the class on that path could potentially participate even in synchronous meetings at a different. All right, so let's support social presence, especially with, in a text-based environment. Well, the challenge is, of course, there's no visual cues often. And even when people try to create videos for discussion posts, it's sometimes very hard to do that well. If you create a 30-second or a 30-second video, maybe okay, but a 3-minute video, which might be the equivalent of a 200 or 300 word post, sometimes without a transcript to go along, that's hard to follow. And it might not be very impactful. Shorter videos, more likely to be so, but those are then more social reasons for having those. So other things, when we have appropriate tones in our messages, we're challenging and questioning, but we're really doing it in more a positive and responsive approach rather than a critiquing approach. There's a place for critique kind of language, and it's not necessarily in the midst of all of our online discussions that we may be doing with all of our students. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create this opportunity for this open communication. Now, the third element of this, and this is really critical, is the teaching presence. And essentially, there's two components to this. The teaching presence is made up of the design of the educational experience. And so students should know that if I do what I'm being asked to do in this class, no matter what mode I'm in, it's likely to lead to learning. It makes sense to me, and it's maybe explained to me as well. Here's what we're doing this week. We're doing a different activity this week. Here's why we're doing this activity. Or we're all doing online discussions. I know you're here in class, or I know you're here in the Zoom session, but we're also going to do an online asynchronous discussion, and here's why. And maybe here's some time that you can do it. So understanding the educational experience, how it's designed, and how it's going to help me learn is an important part of this. And so that's on us, essentially, as designers and faculty and teachers, to explain that to students, to make it clear to them. And if they have questions about it, to be ready to answer those questions and not feel like they're disrespecting us, questioning our expertise. Another aspect of this, of course, is facilitation. If you're having interactions for them to do, you should be part of that, either as an observer and a commentator and a coach, or perhaps as a co-participant, like in a lot of online discussions. You might have a role, if you create a prompt that you can contribute to as well, you can contribute your own ideas as a co-learner, essentially, because I find that oftentimes I do learn from students when we're talking about interesting things, where there's a lot of context specificity. Once again, teaching presence is all about supporting the cognitive presence. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure that what we're doing as a teacher is supporting the students' learning. We wouldn't do anything else, right? Of course. So some of these elements, instructional management, we're helping them build understanding. We're creating opportunities for them to build understanding, which means they have to be, we kind of generate some opportunity for them to get new information about applications, and then we have an opportunity for them to practice those ideas with each other's in ways that allow them to be, those ideas and their understandings to be exposed so that the community can react to them, and that then they would then learn from that interaction. There's also a role for direct instruction, right? So there are times when you need to do lectures in your classes. Maybe they're short lectures, but you are an expert in your field. That's why you're here. And so that's part of your role, is to, provide that opportunity for learners to hear from you. And sometimes students really like that, especially if you are a world-renowned expert in a particular area. They might take your course because they know you wrote the book on this. And that's important to be able to talk to them, not talk to them directly, not all the time, but certainly some of the time. So that's an important aspect of this as well. Don't forget that there is value even in our kind of more traditional forms of providing instruction for students, as long as it's not dominated by any particular mode. In most classes, a mix of modes and mix of approaches is typically best. So when we want to support this, well, first of all, what gets in the way of this? Well, either maybe we just haven't been there to facilitate anything that's going on between live sessions, especially with our asynchronous learners. If we're not there, that's going to, there's no teaching presence there. Or perhaps the course is just not very well designed. It's just a collection of stuff. And then you find that you do okay in the live class, perhaps. So, oh, this means this, or this is there for that, and everything is a verbal explanation. And your asynchronous learners are left; they don't get that verbal explanation. They may find that there's no reason to watch that video because you're just kind of rambling around. So they don't watch it, even though you think that they're going to watch it and you intend for them to watch it. So teaching presence includes a strong element of good design as well as the interaction. Now, one last concept here, transactional distance. This is also coming from the world of distance education. And because our HyFlex courses always have a component of online learning, and it's usually usually an asynchronous component and oftentimes a synchronous component. This is also important for us. All right, this came out from the distance education literature once again, decades ago, and it was relevant then, and it is still very relevant now. So the idea here is that when we're learning at a distance, online, disconnected in time, most likely, and mostly disconnected in place almost all the time as well. So there's a distance element there. And that distance element is something that students who kind of grew up in a face-to-face learning environment, that might be disquieting to them. It might be difficult for them to get through. Some students rely on less distance, right? They don't like to learn on their own. They like to be more closely guided in their learning. And it may be a more social environment, but it's really about their ability to learn on their own. That would be students with what we would call a low level of learner autonomy. They don't have a high capacity for learning on their own and managing on their own. Yet there are other students who are on the opposite side of this. Okay, so these students have a high level of learning autonomy. They're good learners on their own. They're good independent learners, you might say. And so they don't necessarily need to be talked through every step of a path to learn or to solve a problem. They may like to be learning more independently on their own. We would say that they have a high level of autonomy. And so the transactional distance is a measure of this distance. It's like a psychological and a learning/teaching kind of distance that we find in our courses. So in an asynchronous online path, large distance. In a face-to-face environment for students, shorter distance. Okay, so if we think about those, where are the fits for HyFlex? Once again, transactional distance, the separation of instructor and learners. We have to bridge this gap. We have to connect this space so that we can have this kind of communication and so this interaction with each other in ways that are meaningful towards learning. All right, it's a pedagogical distance, not just a physical distance. So in the classroom, high dialogue, relatively low structure, which means that the students in the class can influence the structure of the class because they're there and they can ask questions and they can make comments that cause you to change your approach. All right, so high dialogue, a lot of people talking, a lot of guidance available. Low structure, I can influence this by my questions. It's not just a script that we're following from the start to the beginning. A low transactional distance. We're much more close here than we would be in an asynchronous online space. So there's a low level of learner autonomy required. So students who are more dependent upon their environment and on direct guidance are better fit, perhaps, probably, for the classroom environment. So we can offer that to them. If we go down to the online asynchronous space, low levels of dialogue. When there's an interaction, it's through words, and words do not communicate the same as rich face-to-face, in-person social dialogue. Okay, so it's mostly lower dialogue, and there's a high structure typically. If you have an asynchronous path, students have to know when they come in, there's no one else there potentially, and there's no one there to step them through, oh, first you do this, then you do that, unless it's already done, like in the agenda for that particular module or that particular session, whatever you want to call it. So there's a high structure, and it doesn't change, right? There's no one to say, oh, actually, could I do that one before that one? You may build that into your design, but they're not going to be able to say, well, you know what? I'm just not interested in number 4 and 5. Can I just skip that? Typically not. Here's the path. Here's what you follow if you want to, get essentially your credit for participation. So low dialogue, high structure, high transactional distance. What kind of students are a good fit for high transactional distance? Ones with high levels of autonomy. All right. They're typically good independent learners. They're oftentimes a better fit for online asynchronous. That doesn't mean they wouldn't necessarily choose a classroom or online synchronous path. Sometimes they like talking to other people, but they still are really good high autonomy. So they have a lot of good independent characteristics as far as learning. And so these are the students that if you had to tell everybody to go online, you would have no problem. They would say, okay, no problem. Yep, maybe we'll come back to next week. I like talking to other people, but I can learn fine on my own. The online synchronous is kind of a mix of this. You can have high dialogue if students choose to interact through the medium that you're using. There's a moderate amount of structure because it is technology mediated, and there's probably less deviation from interactions with synchronous online students than there are face-to-face students. So you could call it kind of a medium transactional distance, high in some areas, low in some other ones. So where does that fit with HyFlex? Well, actually, HyFlex, we've got the classroom. For our low autonomy students, we've got the online asynchronous path for our high autonomy students, and we've got the online synchronous. Oftentimes I find the students in online synchronous have elements of both. They like dialogue, and they might have the opportunity to influence structure. But typically they don't want to learn totally on their own in asynchronous. They like to have the interaction with other people and be able to ask their questions. And so they're kind of a mix of this. Probably closer to the classroom. I'd say the synchronicity component is probably closer to what's contributing to this idea of lower transactional distance compared to the asynchronous path. So synchronous or asynchronous is probably a bigger difference than classroom versus online. All right, so when we talk about different kinds of engagement in the classroom, what are we looking at? Well, what we've done before, it's quite possible, as a matter of fact, it's quite likely that it's still going to work quite well in the HyFlex course. Students have to interact with each other, with the content, with the instructor. We can do this in various ways. So we have interactive lectures, we have small group activities and discussions. You might use games, role plays, debates. You can do a lot of different things. So I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on that. If you want more information on that, you can find that in lots of different places. Here's a couple of resources. These are both ones that I came across at the beginning of the pandemic, and so I continue to use them here just because they have a lot of good ideas. And what we were trying to do then is we're trying to figure out, well, how do we get engagement in the classroom when we're also social distancing, or we're in a mixed mode class where half our students are remote online and half our students are in person, or some other combination like that. And so there's a resource here that was contributed by Derek Bruff and his team at Vanderbilt, and I find it very useful. So it's still active, so I have it linked here. And there's another document that was created by colleagues at Louisiana State University that was essentially crowdsourced. So they had an open document others could contribute to, and they kind of manage that. And so you might be able to find this document still helpful and still useful for you because it talked about active learning for students in the classroom, online synchronously, perhaps online asynchronously, and ideas that would cross all of those. Very similar to HyFlex, although it may not have been designed as a complete HyFlex environment. So those are some resources that might help you. Here's where the Vanderbilt link goes here, and this is the post that was created. Very helpful, and that might be useful for you. The engagement with online synchronous students, well, what you do in the classroom might work well in the synchronous mode, depending upon whether it relies on local artifacts or not. If it's discussions primarily, you can do that online synchronously, right? Small group breakouts. We do a lot of small group breakouts in classroom, and we do the exact same thing online. We just don't see each other in the various groups. Every group has its own space. And so that's a difference. It's a different experience, but it still can be very interactive. Students still have to interact with you and each other and the content. If you don't design for interaction with them, like structure something, it probably won't happen. They're not just going to be able to, talk to the person next to them unless you put them in a space where they're okay to talk to each other, right? So you have that control as a designer, as a faculty member. I like to treat students as if they're in a physical classroom as much as possible. If I call students in person, I want to call on students online synchronously. I want them to have their audio and video on, but I don't require it. I try to give them reasons to turn it on. So if I come into class and I have a lot of Zoom students and most of their videos are off, one of the first things I'll do is modify my approach, unless I design for this. Say, okay, let's do a 3-minute breakout let's talk about this. And it's some topic that's relevant. Maybe, the best thing you got from a reading or something you noticed about your life that now you can apply these ideas to. So in a breakout, I know most of their videos come on. Not all, but most of them. And then when we come back to the large class, we do a debrief and most of the videos stay on. And so I end up with kind of resetting the class. So instead of like 30% of the windows on or the videos on, now maybe we're at 60 or 70%, which is for me is a little bit more interactive. And it helps me as the instructor. And I think it helps a lot of the students too. There are a lot of other tools you can use, the platform tools. So if you're using Zoom, there's good interactivity tools in Zoom. There are lots of other activities that you can do, lots of resources. There are ways to facilitate discussions in the live classroom as well in the live classroom, but also in online synchronous space. And so there's some resources around that. If you want to do assessment and discussion, you can do that. My assessment and discussions is mostly informal. I give them formal assessment is really participation. Did you do the number of posts we're asking for? More than trivial posts. And I find it easier to keep track. It's faster for me to do, of course. And my students are very responsible and actually contributing well to the discussions. I think there's some social pressure for reasonable contributions as opposed to just, trivial kind of statements. It just no one's doing that, and so no one does it. And there's some other good ideas here that you can take a look at that might be helpful for you. When we talk about online asynchronous engagement, what do you have available for you? Well, you might have a tool that would allow them to engage in some sort of learning process, or maybe it's a group project process that supports that kind of more substantial interaction, maybe with richer media. Most of us spend most of our time online asynchronously engaging and interacting in the asynchronous discussion forums. And so you can do that really well. There's a lot of good guidance for that. You have to be there. I personally, I schedule like 3 days a week, at least an hour of time, and I go into 2 or 3 different classes and do kind of catch up on discussions. I don't reply to every post, but I make sure I'm part of every significant thread that's going on in the discussion. The students see that. And it helps draw them back into the conversation. They know I'm there, and I give them some good feedback and ask them questions and push them on ideas and things like that. So that really works well. So the students do have to interact with everyone if possible, right? And they do interact if they choose to participate. I mean, my classes, I give them a significant amount of credit for being there in participating in asynchronous discussions, typically 10% of their grade. But a student could do fine in the class without doing anything in an asynchronous discussion, but I know their learning would be much weaker, and we wouldn't have been able to have our learning influenced by their ideas either. So I don't want them to feel like they have to participate in the online discussion or they don't complete the class. But I do want most of them are still motivated by grades. I do want them to know, hey, it could make a whole grade difference if you decide not to be part of our discussions. So in my case, they all do. So when we're talking about engaging online students, there's a lot of good resources here. There's this Tech Variety book that has a couple of free chapters. It's a book you can buy, but you can also get all the chapters available online as PDFs. And there's a couple of other links here that you can take a look at when you have the time. Just showing you what the Tech Variety book allows you to do. This was done by Kurt Bonk and Elaine Koo, and very graciously they make available the full chapters free. And so chapters 10 and 11 are around interactivity and engagement. Those might be the most relevant for you if you're looking for ideas around on engagement online. And honestly, remember, if we can engage our students online, you might expect your face-to-face students to engage online as well. And if you do that, now you've got a shared experience that everybody's doing, and they're engaging all on an equal basis. That helps create the sense of a community. So sharing, having students in different modes doing the same activities helps you support that idea of a learning community. Here's another resource that can be helpful for managing large classes online, and sometimes we use HyFlex in very large classes. I've seen HyFlex done in a class of 1,200 students, and you can do that well, and you can do that very poorly. So if you have a large class, learn how to do that well and make it interactive so that's a good learning experience. So this is the resource from Rensselaer Polytechnic. or Rensselaer Institute of Technology, sorry. Interactive online activities. And so there's a link here. You can go to lots of different places. They have several different aspects of what they're talking about. But it's important that your HyFlex course, especially because of the online component of it, it includes instructional activities, include reflection and discussion. There's another resource I want to provide for you to take a look at, and this is a taxonomy of tools that are available on time. Many of these are free. These are all have at least a free access point, and sometimes they're freemium. So you get some ability to use them for free, and then you can pay for more. This list here has been it's been updated more than at least once. 2020, I think, is the last update. But these are tools that you can use for interaction. You could use them for interaction, but you could also use them for developing content or sharing content or creating content through students interacting. Remember, that could be a source of content. You could use them for formative evaluation. You know, it's because students, they can understand how they're learning better as they interact with each other and test out ideas and hear your feedback. You provide your ideas, etc. You can use them for lots of reasons, but they're basically all tools that'll help you create an interactive, engaging environment. Now, when you do choose technologies, yeah, here's the list here. It's really a nicely done paper, very accessible, and have a whole list. This is an example of what's on the list, the different areas of technologies that they found to be available free and online. You got to check those technologies to make sure they're accessible for your students, especially if you know you have students who have accommodations. Make sure that these technologies meet those accommodations, or choose another tool. You might choose a range of tools or give students a couple of tools to choose from, especially if they're free. But you have to be aware of that being a potential challenge too for students. If you ask them to use too many different technologies in your class, they're not going to go well for many of them. You know, especially if they've got 3 or 4 classes and you're offering 2 or 3 technologies, someone else is picking 2 or 3 different ones. Someone else might have 2 or 3 other ones. All of a sudden, the students are being asked to use 5 or 6 different technologies to support their learning. Fair to students? Maybe. Probably overwhelming for some, and so that's going to be a challenge. So choose the technologies careful, find some favorites, and then maybe share those with your colleagues. So, hey, you want to do interaction? Let's all use this tool. Here's an account we can all use, or here's how you can use it free. Now, when we talk about engagement, we don't want to leave this conversation without talking about engaging across all modes. I've mentioned this several times just in the short presentation. If we can do this in a particular way that all the students, no matter what mode they've chosen to participate in, can be part of, I think that's typically a win, as long as we can meet our outcomes, as long as it doesn't make it a less than kind of experience, right? But we want them to intentionally interact with each other. And so having shared activities, perhaps it's a weekly discussion forum, perhaps it's a way of doing like a draft review process for major assignments, like papers you might offer, where the peer review is not in person, but online as an assignment that everybody does on an equal basis. If you have a technology that will support that. Now, everybody's giving peer review to everybody else. Not everybody, but the selection is not dependent upon who's in the classroom, who's online synchronous, who's online asynchronous. And they can actually get some good sense of getting to know each other, even if they never see each other in person or through the Zoom box. Okay, so those are some ideas. You can refer to those if anyone was in the live session and you're doing a recording from a live session. You can refer to those who are watching it as a recording and let them know, hey, here's a component for you. Those of you who are watching this later, we want you to interact with us as well. We're doing this breakout right now, and we're creating our notes in the shared document. We want you to participate in that document as well. So add your notes to it after you've watched this point in the presentation, or maybe after the debrief, right? So for those watching later online, I like to use a phrase like that, so they know that we're aware that they're there, and we invite them to engage with us, even though it might happen at a little different time. So common assignments, common assessments, group projects. Oftentimes, if I do group projects, I don't tell you have to work with people in the same mode. Sometimes people choose that because they know those people maybe a little bit better. But in order to support this idea that you don't have to be in the same mode to have this work well, is I don't use a lot of class time for group process. We use a little bit, right? Maybe decisioning or things like that, or just getting started. but not more than that. So the bulk of their work is happening out of class anyway, which means it really doesn't matter if they like to come to class in person or online synchronous or online asynchronous, as long as they can coordinate their work outside of class on their own. I can give them some ideas. I can give them some suggestions. We can provide a tool for them to use, or they can use any tool they want. Then they're self-managing that group, and then they can self-manage the way they're participating. I've had some groups that even with asynchronous learners primarily, they schedule a different class, a different meeting time for their group, and they meet synchronously online. Sometimes they meet in person, as a matter of fact, if they're regionally located. So there are ways we can do this. And so these are some of the connections among students that I use. In module 4, or actually later in module 3, you'll see a video that includes me talking through an example of one of my classes I teach, and I'll talk about these different ways I connect students through these interactions. But these are things that we do in every class, pretty much every class I use, except for the small groups. I don't use groups in every class. We do a lot of breakout groups, but not like project groups. But these are all important, and they provide an opportunity for creating connections among students. I've also asked students what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and they've been very gracious in giving me their feedback. Here's an example of some of their feedback, especially from our earlier years. You can find it in the book around student experience in that. That can all be useful. So when we're talking about engagement, summarizing pretty much, you've got engagement ideas that you've used before. They're probably fixed in a single mode. Now, if we add in like 2 modes, face-to-face and online, and now maybe even 3 modes, if you've got that kind of a complex environment, what engagement approaches will work in each mode that you can manage? They have to work within your resources too, right? Especially time, because you have to be there. You have to be able to manage the engagement. So you can't give them, 5 wonderful things to do in engagement that you only have time to facilitate 2 of them. That's not going to work, right? So pick a moderate number, start small, and then maybe get a little bit more advanced as you come up with new ideas, or maybe your students give you new ideas. But what works in class? What would work online to help create a sense of achieving the same learning outcomes? And how about online asynchronously? I find that I naturally do engaging stuff in the classroom just because of the social aspect of that. And a lot of that translates to the online synchronous space. It's a little bit more difficult, especially when people are hiding behind the black boxes, right? And then there's a whole nother area of engagement that has to happen with online asynchronous students. So I designed specifically for the synchronous environment and the asynchronous environment. And then I find ways to modify or maybe change the traditional way of doing something synchronously to add in a component that the asynchronous learners then contribute back to. So even though they're doing it kind of after the fact, and then maybe they're more commenting on what they've seen us and heard us talking about, they're still part of that engagement and that activity more than just as a casual observer, right? And then I also take some of my the activities designed for asynchronous, and I give points for the synchronous students in class or online to contribute into those discussions as well, or those interactions. So that's how I do my redesign. And like I said, when I talk through my course and show you that, you'll see exactly what I do. And if you have questions about it, put them into the discussion forum for module 3 or any of the modules, really. There's another tool you can use, a workshop support tool that's available in the workshop. It's also available in the book. Download a Word document, type into this, whatever you want to do. Use it as a talking document to share with your colleagues as well if you're working with others on this. What engagement strategies would you use in class, online synchronous, online asynchronous? How would they work in each area? And are there things that you could do that would cross all those areas? And so you might have a single strategy, like using an asynchronous online discussion for application-oriented discussions every week. That's kind of how I would describe what I do. It would be the same for every student because we're doing it out of class. And then the workflow adjustment. I find that for my workflow adjustments, if it's happening in the live session, there's not really any adjustment for me or really for the students. I mean, the stuff we do in class. Right. But if there's a workflow adjustment where I'm requiring them all to do something asynchronously and I have to be there facilitating, now I have to adjust my workflow, because during the week, that means I've got to schedule some time that I'm not going to use for other things associated with teaching or being employed where I'm employed, and I'm going to use it for facilitating online discussions. I'm happy with that as long as I plan it, as long as that is supported and respected by those who tried to schedule me into other meetings. So here are some samples, of course. There are more samples posted to the workshop site. This is for a biology course. Here's an example of discussion threads. They were using the Brightspace D2L. Available for all students, available for all students, available for all students. If I wrote this out, I'd probably say required for all students, required for all students, and maybe even graded, right? They get points for being there, which is an additional enticement that I found I kind of need to do to get my students to be part of that on a regular basis. Well, thank you very much for getting in, to the end of this. I hope this was interesting. I hope that there are some resources there that you can find that'll be helpful for you as you continue thinking about designing and actually putting down some ideas about redesigning your course for HyFlex, or even if you're not going to do a full HyFlex, at least a hybrid version of this, so that you can better meet the needs of your students for flexibility and for having access to multiple modes of learning. Thank you.